There's a relatively small religious group from the late 1700s and the early 1800s that you've probably never heard of before, and it's called the Clapham sect. This sect was a group of Christians in England. It started out just out of the church of Clapham. It's a neighborhood of London. It's just some neighborhood on the south side there. This sect was known for their missionary work. They did a lot of charity work. They cared about prisoners, the quality of the life of those in prison. They opposed kind of what they considered to be cruel sports or blood sports, like dog fighting and other animal fighting that would have been going on back at this time. They supported what was an early Sunday school movement to poor farmers' children and poor miners' children. This is back when Sunday school was actual kind of K through 12 education. Just it had to be on a Sunday because children of farmers and such, they were living on the farm all the week and couldn't go to regular school. And so Sunday school was an actual school, and this group supported that. This core group was only about 20 to 30 members, and aside from their fairly common and even mundane Christian work, they really have a unique place, not just in Christian history, but in secular history as well. They're most known for starting one of the biggest movements against the worst social injustice of their day. This small group of 20 to 30 people is largely responsible for abolishing slavery and the slave trade throughout the British Empire. I forgot to mention one of their leading members was William Wilberforce. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 13, so as you turn there, just be thinking for a moment, our culture really likes for us to go big. We have that phrase, go big or go home. We always forget go home is one of the options. You don't have to go big every time, but that's never really considered in that sort of either or equation. It's just the go big, right? Like if something is good, we want everyone to do it. If we believe in our political position, everyone should do that, and anybody who doesn't agree with our position, well, they're a moron, obviously. And with enough convincing, they would come around to see things the right way, our way, right? We want something to work for everybody. We want everyone to buy into a particular system. And sometimes this infects our thinking as Christians. There's this kind of dissonance that the younger generation of Christians feels with Christianity proper and with older generations of Christians. And here's where that line of dissonance falls. We hear stories from the past of the good old glory days. And glory days of Christendom in North America means the days in which we were the majority, where our values were the prevalent values, where even if people maybe didn't show up to church, they at least kind of understood who we were and maybe at least appreciated that a little bit. Obviously, that is not the world we live in today. And so we have inherited kind of an intellectual Christianity that tells us, well, if Christianity were done right, it would be big. It would be great. We would control things. But we live in a world where we don't experience that, and that's not even on the horizon for younger generations, and this creates a deep sense of dissonance. Maybe you feel this sense of dissonance on a personal level. Maybe you feel the sense that the secular world, the secular culture is taking over. Your voice is getting smaller and smaller. Maybe you feel like you're one of the few or only Christians in your workplace or in your neighborhood or maybe even in your family. Today, Jesus is going to give us a couple of stories that serve as both an encouragement for us, but also a warning for today. The first of these parables is the parable of the weeds. This begins in verse 24. I'll read. He says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain and the seeds appeared also, and the weeds appeared also, and the servant of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Then how does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Jesus starts this parable. This is in his third discourse in the book. We've already covered his first two, starting with the Sermon on the Mount. And discourse number 3 is largely him just teaching through a series of parables, kind of back to back. And he often compares these things. He uses a simile. The kingdom of heaven is like. That's a simile. The problem is, in English, sometimes this gets flattened, but there's a little bit of a nuance in Greek. I don't like to make too much of these nuances, but I actually think here this one is important. And so if you're reading NIV is going to flatten these to all just say, the kingdom of heaven is like. But there's actually 3 tenses that Jesus tells these parables in. One is the present tense, it is like. Another one is it has become like. And a third tense is it will be like. That's a future tense. And so if we think about the nuances, if we say, well, the kingdom of heaven is like, this gives us an analogy. It's for the here and now. How is the kingdom presently? What is it presently like? How should we understand it and apply it to our lives now? When we think about it, the parables that he says the kingdom of heaven will be like in the future, this is often usually some kind of warning that Jesus is giving us. When he talks about the future, there's some kind of warning. And so how should we prepare so that we don't fall prey to whatever Jesus is warning us about? But in the first parable today, he opens with this tense, which is, it has become like. This tells us how the kingdom is different now than it will be in the future. This depicts a sense where the kingdom is announced, but is not yet fully enacted. There's some kind of response that makes the kingdom seem disputed or in trouble. So it's announced, and in the future, the kingdom is going to be completely enacted with all of its glory, with all of its justice, with God ruling completely, with no one opposing him. But the kingdom now has become like a different scenario. One day it will be fantastic. Right now, it's a contested space. And so that's actually what this story starts with. The kingdom has become like. ESV will translate all of these tenses. They do it consistently. They'll translate it as can be compared to, which is a legitimate translation, but I think the timing is important. The kingdom of heaven has become like this. And the parable tells this dramatic story. It's a story of a farmer who does all of the work that a farmer's expected to do, all of the toil, all of the labor, and then the next morning or sometime after, he wakes up and finds the last thing that he wants. He spent all of this time and energy and money planting, and now, instead of seeing the fruit of his labors with that satisfied feeling, he gets this news report of, the crop is tainted. We're not gonna be able to use it. We have to do something about the problem of this crop. Even today, this is a hazard to modern farmers. They have to deal with the threat of weather. You can have not enough rain. You can have too much rain. You can have the wrong kind of rain, i.e. hail. You can have high temperatures. You can have too low of temperatures. You can have pests. You have insects or disease, weeds, animals coming and eating. Where I'm from, we have a lot of wild pigs, and it looks like whenever they get through farmers' fields, it looks like somebody went through there with a backhoe. They are just an army of many that tear things up. They tear through fence posts. They leave a devastation in their path. You can have soil conditions that aren't right. It could be deficient of some kind of mineral, or it could be too heavy, too much clay. It could be too salty, too sandy. This is not to mention other factors like planting at the wrong time, planting at the wrong depth, or just changes in activity, things you can't control, like the bee population being decimated or moving somewhere else. So many factors that farmers have to think about every day that make farming a difficult task. The same was true for the ancient world. But in this story, there's the addition. There's an additional piece of news that we get. There's been weeds sown, and it's not just tainted seed that was sown. There's an enemy present. I have a slide here of what most people believe is, one of these is wheat, and the other is a plant called bearded darnel. How many of you think the wheat is on the right? How many of you think the wheat is on the left? How many of you didn't vote? I'm calling you out. All right. The wheat is on the left, so a lot of you should not be farmers. And I think a lot of you know that, which is why you probably didn't vote, right? But it looks very, very similar. These are not plants that look vastly different. And so even today, this is actually a problem. The real issue is when they're in their infancy, before they bear fruit, they're almost imperceptibly different. Like you can't tell a difference at all. And so this makes the difference very, very difficult to spot, and it's difficult to eliminate because the roots are growing together. This is a weed that took hundreds of years to root out of Europe. In 2010, there were only 6 known instances or 6 reported instances of this weed being found there. Other countries, though, are still dealing with a massive problem. In Ethiopia, for instance, people estimate that about 10% of their harvest is infected with this weed. Now, this weed isn't exactly poisonous. I don't think it will kill you, but it's also not good for humans either. The Latin name for this weed is also the Latin word for drunkenness. And so this weed will cause dizziness and it will cause nausea. Actually, some people have thought about trying to make bread or beer with it just to give it a little extra something, but there's obviously a dangerous element with trying an experiment like that. The farmer in this parable, he's woken up and found terrible news, but there's one additional piece. It's not just, you've got this weed, now what are you going to do? The additional news is an enemy has actually crept into your field and has done this thing to you. The cloud is cast over what should be a joyous day, a day that every farmer looks to, the day where you get paid, you harvest, you sell. It's where all of the expenses and the toil kind of balance out, you hope. But he has to instruct his workers, don't pull the weeds now, wait until the time of harvest, and then we will separate them out. Jesus, on the back of this parable, he tells 2 more parables immediately. One is the parable of the mustard seed. It says he put another parable before them saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it's larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Here, Jesus is making a parable, but this is also an allusion to several different Old Testament passages. There's a lot of discussion throughout the prophets, the writings of the prophets, that reference trees. If you remember our Christmas Eve service, it was kind of a weird one, but that was actually what the deal was with the trees, is the early passages of Matthew are referencing the early passages of Isaiah, which are talking all about trees and stumps and forests being burned down. And there's this great analogy that Isaiah is painting that Matthew is borrowing to talk about the drama and the danger that Jesus faced when he was born in Bethlehem and Herod came to try to kill him. But again, Jesus is pulling up another tree analogy. And in this tree analogy, all of these birds at the end of the parable, these birds are going to come and nest in the branches. And if you go back to the Old Testament references where God talks about planting his people and they're going to grow up like this amazing tree. And then it talks about all of the birds coming. Well, the birds are the Gentile nations. And so God is going to plant his people as if it were in a garden. It's going to grow up into this amazing tree. And then all of the Gentile birds are going to come and nest and find a home in this tree. Now, he uses one line in here that the mustard seed is the smallest of all the seeds. I have a picture of it here for you. There we go. So, it is legitimately a small seed, but if you've ever planted a garden, you've probably seen seeds that are smaller. So to the skeptical mind, this creates a problem, right? If Jesus gets it wrong, then God is wrong. The Bible is wrong. Can we trust anything in the Bible if Jesus doesn't even know what the smallest seed is? Let me just explain that for a little bit, because that might sound, maybe it sounds a little bit off to you, but for a lot of people, that's actually a big problem. But before I describe that, just look for a moment. This is the difference between the size of the seed and the tree. Now, that tree looks large because you see these little deer out there. Just so you know, those little deer are about this tall, so not very large deer. The tree is maybe 15, 20 feet tall and maybe about the same around. But just imagine for a moment that you're unloading a dishwasher with a child. And the child, you're pulling out all of, the big Yeti and the Stanley kegs, mugs, and you pull out the mugs and the juice cups. So you have all these different sizes, and the child picks up the juice cup and says, look, this is the smallest of all the cups. Now, technically speaking, that's not true. We could say, well, kiddo, don't you know there's Turkish teacups, there's espresso shot cups, there's alcoholic shot cups, I've been told. right? Foolish child, there's all of these other cups. That's not the smallest one. Get your facts straight. That would be a really foolish person who took a child on like that. Because the statement is in reference to what? What are we looking at right here? So when we take a statement out of context, we often say Jesus is Lord, but context is king. When we pull a scripture out of context, we go, well, look, Jesus just doesn't know botany. How can God, if Jesus is God, how can he not know this stuff? Well, the answer is he does. He's talking in a specific context. He's speaking in first century Israel to a bunch of farmers who are dealing, what's the previous parable? Wheat. And he's just picking up something off of a bush that's like on every single street corner there. And he goes, look, it's the smallest seed. So the point really is not about how small the seed is, or even how big a mustard tree becomes, because it's really not an impressively large tree. They had cedars in the area, much like our cedars grow to be quite impressive trees. Jesus is speaking in a context. There are mustard seeds and saplings and these trees all over the place. And so by comparison, you could look at an olive tree and go, well, olive seed has a much larger seed, right? Those things are yay big. But an olive tree is considerably smaller than a mustard tree. Jesus is making a point about something small that becomes something quite large. It's an illustration to make a particular point about the kingdom, and that's the point that we have to judge Jesus on. The mustard seed is not the smallest, nor is the tree the largest. Jesus could have chosen something larger, but it's not the absolute size of the tree or the seed that Jesus is referencing. It's the disparity between the two. The tree, which starts as something the size of a speck, becomes something that creates its own kind of ecosystem in the desert around. All of these birds come and they nest in the tree. Other small animals come and nest in the tree. Mustard trees grow very quickly. They often reach their full height in just a few years. They survive very well in harsh conditions. Their edible fruit and the shade that they provide, it creates an ecosystem for birds and insects and small mammals even. Though that might not be in mind in the passage here, these trees provide medicinal uses. The wood can be used for carpentry. It provides a small alternative fuel source. Oftentimes in Middle Eastern cultures, they use the twigs from these trees as toothbrushes. And the color is good for dyeing clothes. It's a very useful tree. The kingdom might seem small and insignificant now, but give it time, and even in the harshest of conditions, it's going to grow and it's going to become a place of blessing. When you're in the full sun, I know that sounds great to people in Seattle, but once you have enough of the sun, you'll understand at some point you go, I've had enough, I need some shade. And then to find that spot of shade, it's like an oasis. And these little mustard trees create these mini oases out there in the desert. This seed, which started small and imperceptible, a group of fishermen and poor people who were following some unnamed teacher, eventually becomes this thing that takes over the Roman Empire, that takes over the entire world. It becomes a tree that's big enough for all of the Gentiles to come and find shelter in. Immediately, he tells them another parable, the parable of the leaven. In verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. 3 measures of flour is a very generic term, but there's another story in the Bible where 3 measures of flour is used, and the term's a little bit more specific. There's a story in Genesis where Abraham and Sarah are sitting there and 3 visitors come. We learn in that story that these are angelic visitors. They're going to go on and judge Sodom and Gomorrah. But as they come by Abraham and Sarah's camp, Abraham says, hey, you're not going to pass on, come here, we're going to make some food. And he tells Sarah, hey, make us a little food. And it says she used 3 measures of flour. Those 3 measures of flour is about 6 gallons of flour. I don't know when the last time you ate a gallon of flour was, but chances are it's been a minute. That's a lot of bread that she made. But the point is, again, it's not the exact measurement of the flour. It's the size. There's only a little bit of leaven, and even with a lot of flour, the leaven is effective. Now, leaven, if you go through the scriptures, a lot of times this is a sign of sin. But it's not always a sign of sin. Sometimes it's a sign of God's blessing. There are certain instances where God commands them to eat bread with leaven in it. Other times where they're commanded to eat bread without leaven in it. Sometimes metaphors change. For instance, both Jesus and Satan are spoken of by analogy of a lion. Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah, right? That demonstrates something about his nature. But Satan is what? He's a roaring lion that's roaming, seeking whom he may devour. So sometimes the metaphor works in multiple applications. And I would say if you're coming at this from leaven is sin, it doesn't always mean that. There are other examples. And in this example, it's this idea that there's going to be this leaven, the kingdom that's going to fill, it's going to be imperceptible. You're not going to see it. Once it's mixed in, you no longer see the leaven in bread. In fact, he uses the word hide. The woman took and hid 3 measures, mixed in, and it's out of view to the point where you can't see it. And yet, the results are explosive. I remember the first time when I was a kid, seeing my mom make bread, just being amazed to see the bread expand as she made it, as the leaven took effect. There's different kinds of flours and different processes for making bread, but in general, yeast makes up about 1% to 2% of the weight of the flour. Yeast causes bread to rise, and it creates space in the bread, which gives it that light and fluffy consistency that we love. The kingdom might seem like a small and hidden thing, but if you mix it in and let God work, give it time to grow, it will take over the loaf. Not to dominate it, but to make it better. The mustard tree is not trying to take over and to dominate. It's creating a space of blessing, an oasis in the desert, a place to live. The same thing with leaven in bread. Leavened bread is so much better than unleavened bread. It's just more delicious. It's not science, but it's a fact. And so Jesus goes from these 2 very quick parables. In fact, with this one, he doesn't even tell us the conclusion. He says, look, you put the leaven in and it's leavened. And he kind of moves on with the story. With the other one, he kind of has to give the example of, oh, the tree grows and then birds come and it's a great place. But with this one, he just goes, add the leaven in, next story. Because everyone would have known how effective that would be. And so he moves from here into a brief moment of prophecy about parables. Verse 34, he says, all of these things Jesus said to the crowd in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. Now, if you remember last week, I was talking about him using parables, and the disciples asked him, Jesus, why are you using parables? And basically said, look, I'm using parables to hide God's truth from people who have hardened their hearts. And now he's using an alternate one, so he's kind of balancing things out. There's a sense in which a parable will hide something from the hard-hearted, but there's another sense in which the parable reveals something about God. He's quoting from Isaiah. In the previous one, he's quoting from Isaiah 6, 9 to 10. He says, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. And now he's quoting from Psalm 78. And this is not just a little quote. Psalm 78 is quite a long psalm, and it goes through a lot of Israel's history. But 78, 2 to 4 says, I will open my mouth in parable. I will utter dark sayings from old. Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from the children, but we will tell to the coming generations the glorious deeds of the Lord, that his might and the wonders that he has done. Many people read this psalm as just a simple recounting of Israel's history, but that's not at all what's happening. I mean, he goes and he starts listing all these historic events, but we have to understand it in light of this opening passage. This is written by Asaph. And it's true that Asaph does give historic events, but he's reminding us that the purpose of him retelling these events, one, is to teach truth, to teach God's truth, to make revealed what has been hidden in their history. And so he's saying, look, I'm about to share history with you, but I'm kind of opening the box, as it were, so you can see what's inside. Verse 7 of Psalm 78 says, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. And so he's saying, look, here's the history. I'm going to share kind of from God's perspective, what's the meaning and the interpretation. And there's a purpose to this. The purpose is so that you will be like one generation and not like the other generation. So you'll be the ones who follow God, not the ones who harden their hearts and turn away. And so he opens, like that's the intro to Psalm 78, and then he goes into this story about the Ephraimites. We're all familiar with that story, just nod along. But just to make sure we're all familiar with it, the Ephraimites, these are talked about in Judges. So basically the people are being attacked sort of on a weekly or monthly basis, and as they're being attacked, God will send them a judge, and the judge will sort of organize Israel. They'll mount up a fighting party. They'll kick out the people that are oppressing them, and then they'll worship God for about a minute, and then they fall right back into their own sin. And so in the book of Judges, chapter 12, there's an interaction with one of these guys, and Ephraim. It says, the men of Ephraim were called to arms, and they crossed to Zephon, and they said to Jephthah, why did you cross over and fight against the Ammonites, and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire. A little bit of a dramatic overreaction, like, hey, you didn't invite me to the party. I'm going to come burn your house down. And Jephthah said to them, I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites. And when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites. And the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come to me this day to fight against me? So this story, there's a couple other stories about, they're kind of similar to this, of they were invited to fight and they didn't, and then they got their feelings hurt and, said all kinds of stuff, right? This is a group that loves a good 4th of July parade. They love Memorial Day where they can stand up and be recognized, but when it comes time to fight, when shots are fired, they are safely at home. So Asaph isn't just recording this instance out of nowhere. He's saying, look, I'm going to tell you some parables and some hidden truth, because you need to be the group that follows God and doesn't harden his heart. Now let me tell you a story about the Ephraimites who were called to battle and they shrank back in fear. Here's the lessons from Israel's history that they didn't understand. And so the whole rest of Psalm 78 is story after story after story. I'm just going to very briefly summarize some of these. He says, look, they didn't remember how God parted the Red Sea. If they'd remembered how God parted the Red Sea, they would have shown up to fight because they know God can do anything. They don't need to be afraid. They forgot how he led them with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire through the wilderness, how he gave them water in the wilderness. What did these people do in response to God's salvation? They turned and they sinned. They complained. They doubted God. God responded to that. He was angry because they didn't trust his saving power. And yet, even in his anger, he gives them manna from heaven. He gives them quail because they complained that they wanted meat. They ate and they were filled, but God was angry with them, and he killed the strongest among them. After all of this, they still sinned and didn't believe, in spite of the wonders that they had seen. So he killed them, and they sought him, and they repented earnestly. But they flattered him. They told God what he wanted to hear. If you do this for me, I'll be a missionary for you right here. They make one of those kind of bargains with God. They flattered him. They lied to him. Their heart didn't persevere. They were not faithful. Nevertheless, God was compassionate and atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. God remembered that they rebelled, that they tested and provoked him, that they didn't remember his power or redeeming work. And then Asaph goes through a whole section where he just recounts all of the plagues of Egypt. He goes one by one of things they didn't remember. And so he's kind of building this anticipation of, well, surely now is going to be the time when they actually turn and they follow, right? They realize we've messed up and we better start following. We better follow him wholeheartedly. But instead, Asaph reports they tested God and they rebelled. They turned away. They practiced idolatry. How does God respond to all of this? He rejects Israel, his own people, the people that he carried up out of Egypt across the wilderness, fed hand and mouth day by day. Finally, at some point, he rejects them. He removes his presence from them, and he removes them from the land. He supports Israel's enemies against them. Verse 65 and 66 of that chapter say, finally, God relented and he drove away their enemies. All of this leads to the crescendo at the end of chapter 78. God rejects Ephraim. So the whole warning of 78 is, don't be like the Ephraimites who forgot all of the meaning of this history, that God is looking for us to believe him and be faithful to him and follow him instead of reject and be hard-hearted. And the ultimate end was God rejects Ephraim, but he chooses Judah. Oh, interesting. Judah's in the line of Christ. By choosing Judah, he also chooses David. Verse 70 and 72, let me read it. It says, he chose David, his servant, and he took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. So why does Jesus speak in parables? From last week, it was to conceal truth away from the hard-hearted. And the passage he quotes this week is Israel's history of mostly hard-heartedness, where God is taking care of them. They're hard-hearted, and he has to judge them, with a few moments of them turning in faith towards him. But to this week, according to Psalm 78, the purpose is to reveal hidden wisdom about Israel's past and God's will and his intention. So what does Psalm 78 reveal? It reveals that the people who should have known better from the beginning of time have consistently rejected God's love and his mercy and his provision and his salvation. And because of their rejection, they became rejected. But this rejection led to choosing Judah, and by Judah, he chose David, and he chose David to be a good shepherd. By choosing David, he chose Jesus to be the good shepherd. Here, Jesus is quoting all of this. He's saying, I'm speaking in parables to reveal something. And now he goes, the final verse of 78 is basically saying, here's my lineage, by the way. I'm here. What are they going to do? A few weeks ago, we looked at the passage where Jesus is cursing Chorazin and Bethsaida. He's judging them because they have rejected him. And he's saying, look, there's these other evil cities that you as good Jews have looked down upon because they're your enemies. But if I had done the works that I've done in Galilee, if I had done them there, they would have repented. A couple weeks ago, he talked about the sign of Jonah to the Ninevites, that the evil Ninevites, they are going to return. They returned to God. They repented. And because of this, they are going to come and share in judgment over you. Who are you going to be like? Jesus keeps reiterating there are only two choices. There's his way and there are all the other ways. And so he's sharing this. I'm here to reveal something to you, and that revelation is, look at your history. The hard-hearted people have faced God's judgment and have been rejected. Just because you're born in Israel doesn't mean anything to God. If you reject God, he rejects you. How much more should we feel warned, not being his chosen people? We need to follow him. We need to not harden our hearts to him. And so he kind of circles back to the meaning of the parable of the weeds. Verse 36 says, then he left the crowds and he went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, the one who sows the seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawbreakers. And he will throw them into the fiery furnace, in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Thank you. My emotional support water bottle. So he gives all of these illustrations of here's what it is. In the previous parable, the parable of the soils, the sower, that's a confusing sentence, soils, sower, he's not identified. It's just someone was out sowing seed, and it's more about what is the seed and what are the different qualities of the soils. But in this parable, the sower is clearly identified. He's the Son of Man. And he's planting a seed, and the field where he's planting, this field is the world. Now, many denominations have taken an approach on this passage. A lot of, especially the high church denominations, they would say, well, this field is the church or some kind of representation of the church. The problem is Jesus' own words clearly and quite explicitly state the field is the world. This is not talking about the church. And so rather than showing that this is the church. It's more showing how expansive God's kingdom is designed to be. His kingdom is designed to be over the entire world. Here we see that the seeds are the sons of the kingdom, and opposite of that we have the weeds, the sons of the evil one. There isn't a third category. You're one son or daughter of either of those two camps. There's no third category. Jesus has said this earlier in the previous chapter 12, verse 30. He says, whoever is not with me is against me. Whoever does not gather with me scatters. There's no third option. We're either working with Jesus, gathering, or we are actively scattering. We are either being planted as the sons of the kingdom, or we are being planted as the sons of the evil one. But we are being planted one way or another. In verse 39, we see that the kingdom has become a battleground between God and the evil one. The world is this battleground. Both camps are sowing their people, and they're intermixed just as clearly as those weeds looked like they were very, very similar, and the way that they grow up and spread together. This is how it's going to be. We have to not be naive. We are not walking into neutral territory. We're walking into the territory where two sides are laying their claims, and we have to make a choice. We have to get involved. There's no third option. If you ever look at some of the bloodiest conflicts around the world, they tend to be on areas where two countries have a disputed middle zone that they share together, and they both think this is ours. That's the world that we live in. I think this story, along with the references to the Christian life being difficult that Matthew has made, the likelihood of persecution that Matthew keeps talking about, Matthew's trying to prepare the church for what is to come. Yes, Jesus is going to send us out. Yes, we are sons of the true king. We are part of his kingdom, but there's going to be a challenge with this. This is not going to be just an easy life. We are growing up in his kingdom where the walls haven't quite been finished yet. And it's not just his people inside the walls. Verse 40, we see that the gathering in the story is the end of the age. The story has a clear conclusion. Regardless of how hopeful the farmer seemed or how devastated he must have been or how hard it was for the sons of the kingdom to grow up with the sons of Satan, the story is concluded in the end with God's people being rescued and his enemies being punished. Verse 41 and 42, the angels are the ones who are going to gather and separate and judge those who oppress God in his kingdom, and they're going to be punished. There's an important distinction to be drawn here because we often try to sort this part out ourselves. It's the angels, and it's not us who are responsible for dealing with this. We often forget that, and particularly if you're coming from the Christian narrative of triumphalism of, hey, we used to be the majority and we used to kind of run things and our values were the values. Sometimes it's easy to want that back, but we are not the ones that are set up here in this story to judge or to process who is in and who is out. The angels will do this. The second thing is that this isn't going to happen now, it's going to happen later. It's going to happen at the end. This means we're planted right here, right now, on purpose. God knows what field we're planted in. Why? He's the one who planted us. God planted us in the world, and we are growing up side by side with people who are not his people. We don't need to fight. We don't need to flee. We simply need to live out our purpose. Verse 43, we see that the righteous are going to live in this new kingdom. When the kingdom is finally here, actually here, completely here, in all of its detail, the world is no longer going to be this battleground. And there's a conclusion here that there's a reward for those people. So what does all of this mean for us? I want to break this down according to some of the parables we've talked through. Number one, the parable of the leaven and the mustard seed. Let me just ask you a question. Do you feel like your side is hard to find or underrepresented? Do you feel like as a Christian that you're one of the few Christians in your neighborhood or your school or your office? Do you get this sense of people around you aren't like you and maybe don't even like you? Mix in and let God do his work. God's kingdom is almost imperceptible right now. We're planted like mustard seeds. We're planted like leaven. You don't see it anymore. But at some point, it's going to grow. It's going to expand. It's going to fill all of the spaces with God's blessing. This is who God is calling us to be. Christians, we often push for the majority position. We think we need it because that's the way the world works. The world works according to majority power, according to ruling power. But as God's kingdom, we don't need it because God has all the power. He doesn't need us to vote about it. Yeast, it's only 1% to 2% of the flour's weight, and yet it does its job. You being one of the only Christians in your workplace or your neighborhood or your family, it's enough. Yeast has a hidden quality. It doesn't stand out. You can't really taste it, but you can tell when it's there and when it isn't. The bread is dramatically different. It's qualitatively different whether you add yeast or don't add yeast. The Southern Baptist denomination, they're currently the largest Protestant denomination. So outside of Catholicism in the United States, they're the largest denomination. But they weren't always. And I believe it was a Presbyterian or a Lutheran who did a really interesting analysis on the Southern Baptist denomination. And they said when the Southern Baptists were a minority inside the country, their preaching was great. And he's showing examples of the way that the sermons were formed. And I mean, there were some deep sermons. And then he goes, but now that they're in the majority, the sermons have kind of flattened out. They follow a very similar pattern. They're more centrist, more moderate. He has kind of a point. Being in the majority is not what God has called us to be. You could talk to Christians who come from persecuted countries. They'll tell you something similar. When we were a persecuted minority, our faith was strong. The believers were real believers. Now, we struggle with our faith. We struggle with the same thing that Americans struggle with, the lure of the good life, the distraction of comfort. Will we really follow God now that we have all these comfortable, nice things, and he's calling us to give that up? Before we had nothing and we were persecuted, so what? We often long for success and that feeling of accomplishment or that feeling that it's finished. There's a motivational speaker and writer. He says, success is never owned. It's rented and the rent is due every day. I think there's some truth in that, but I want to give it a slightly cynical, or I would say realistic spin. And I think this means that we never really arrive. There's no true point of actual success. You might never really feel like your job for the kingdom in your sphere is done. Part of this is because Jesus already let us know that most of the people are not going to follow the path. Most people are going to follow the broad path that is easy, not the narrow path that is hard. So there's no winning this if winning means numbers and majority. It's just not going to happen. If we use the parable of the soils, we see that 3 out of the 4 soils weren't suitable for the gospel to grow and to bear fruit in. These are Jesus' words. Too often in our history, we've tried to live on the religious success of the previous generation, but this can't be done. The rent is due in every generation. Our neighborhood or our community can be won or it can be lost in a single generation. Success in the past doesn't grant us success in the here and now. Majority in the past doesn't grant us majority in the here and now. And I think the encouraging thing about these parables is Jesus is saying, it's okay. It doesn't matter because the kingdom is going to start out tiny and then it's just going to grow. It's just what a seed does. It's what the kingdom is going to do. But secondly, from the parable of the wheat and the weeds, I would say one of the things we see from this is that we don't need to be separatists. Christians, very often, we take ourselves out. We look to God's coming kingdom and we see that God's ways are different. We look to the scriptures. We see that he calls us to a certain path. We hear our neighbors saying something totally different. We hear our culture saying something totally different. And we try to pull ourselves out. We try to pull back from our community. Sometimes physically, we move away. A lot of people have done that. We move out of the cities into the suburbs. Christians have done this. Well, guess what? The suburbs are also sinful places where lots of sinners live. You can move out to the countryside, okay? Guess what? A lot of sinners in the countryside as well. All people are sinners. It doesn't matter where you go. We live in a world filled with sin. We cannot take ourselves out. But sometimes people do the opposite. Well, if I'm not going to pull myself back, maybe what I need to do is I need to take my neighbor out, right? I need to get the wicked people out. Or maybe not out, I need to subjugate them. I need to take control so that I'm the one in charge, so that my values are the ones being talked about. We essentially try to remove the other side and claim the field as our own. But Jesus doesn't want this to happen either. He wants both things together. I think this has to do less with holding ground, which is how we seem to think about it, and it has more to do with redeeming a crop. These are stories that tell us general truths, not give us legal or scientific prescriptions. Last week I talked about the soils, and I mentioned to you that if you don't like the soil you are, change it. Jesus is giving us an illustration. This is not a pronouncement. This is not a finished point. He's simply teaching a general truth about how are people. Well, you can tell how people are by how they respond to God's word. If you think you're a bad soil, respond to God's word differently. Obey it, believe it, hang on to it, and you're going to prove yourself to be the good soil. I think the same thing is true of the field. We look at the field of, if we take this as, well, this is just the set, that's it. I think that's how Satan sees this. Satan goes, okay, if I can trick Jesus or if I can trick the church into just taking the harvest now, trying to pull the bad things out now, I can trick them into destroying themselves, which is exactly why in the story the man says, don't do that work now, wait until the end. If you're worried about who's holding the ground, don't worry. Because with God, there's something where he takes dead people and he makes them alive. He takes people who are enemies of God and he makes them his children. He can take a weed and he can make it wheat, I believe. We don't have to worry about holding ground. We don't have to worry about cleaning out the other things that aren't like us. I think we have to be there and we have to be faithful. We have to practice faithful presence. That is the only weapon that God has given us. He's planted us and there's nothing we can do about it. Again, escape to the suburb, escape to the countryside, you'll still be planted in the field next to the other people that are planted in the field. I think we have to consider this, that God has planted us and he is here not to just take one side or the other. He wants the whole thing. And while we know that not everyone is going to follow, our hope should always be this. Charles Spurgeon, he was a preacher a long time ago. He said, I wish that God would save the elect and then elect some more. I wish that God would save the elect and then elect some more. Right? So the elect are those people that are chosen by God. He says God needs to save them, and then he just needs to choose some more people and keep saving them. That needs to be our attitude. God, save the wheat that's in the field. Protect us. But also, there's weeds. Save them. Convert them. Transform them. We need to not be naive. We are living in a contested space. Plants often look alike in their infancy. The weeds and the tares in this story definitely do. How do we tell what a plant is? Plant it and let it grow. When the fruit comes, all of a sudden, we know. We aren't living in a greenhouse. We're living in a field that has an enemy who's going to work against Jesus and his kingdom. For every plan that God has, Satan has a counterfeit. Satan sets traps that if we take the bait, we're going to destroy the work of God. And we have to be patient and let God work. Let me close this with a word of prayer. Lord, when we look at the field that we are in, when we look through our human eyes, there's a lot to be worried about. There's a lot to be afraid of. There's a lot to pull back from. So God, I pray that you would give us different eyes, that you would give us eyes of faith and eyes of hope, that we would see that you have put us here, that you are going to keep us till the end. You are going to take the whole field. It all belongs to you, and Satan is simply setting trap after trap after trap. God, help us to follow you. Help us to follow your wisdom. Jesus, you give us this long, long psalm that you just quote briefly in this story. But what an amazing lesson it teaches. We need to learn the lesson from the past, that we have to follow you, not be one of the hard-hearted people. God, I pray that you would transform us. Lord, as we've talked about the parable of the soils and now the parable of the wheat and the tares, we probably all have people in our life that we've been thinking about. That we go, oh, that person, they got so excited when they heard and then poof, gone. Or we think this person's so hard-hearted, they'll never hear, they'll never believe. And yet we see stories about Saul, who's now Paul. Surely one of the greatest antagonists of the church at that time. You saved him miraculously. You can take hard ground and you can break it. And so God, we pray for those names that we think about in our family, in our community, in our work. We pray that you'd be breaking up this hard ground, that you'd be transforming the ground so that it would hear your word and believe it. Lord, we ask this in your name. Amen.